Thank you. Welcome back from the break. I know it was a bit shorter than announced. Please do enter. We have a very interesting session on WIPO news and an update on UDRP and URS waiting for you. Good. We're closing the doors. As I said, we are also very happy to have a very good relationship with WIPO, and we have Brian Beckham, who is the head of Internet Dispute Resolution, WIPO Arbitration and Mediation Center, with us to give us first a general update on WIPO news, and then following that, Brian will, together with Jonathan Agman, who is the director of Soroco, Agman and Nordman in Singapore, and he's also the secretary of the ECTA Internet Committee. The two of them will provide an update and a discussion on the UDRP and URS system reform. But let's first start with the general WIPO update. Brian, please.
Thank you, Annette. And thank you for having invited us. Good morning, everyone. So, a lot of interesting things going on at WIPO over the past year and years, and I'll try to walk you briefly through some of the highlights. For domain names, arbitration, and mediation, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. And for the Madrid system, my colleague Sarah Amini, who some of you may have met last night, is here to answer some questions as well. So, there we go. So just a little bit about WIPO. As you all probably know, we are where IP norms are discussed globally, and that has produced a lot of tools that practitioners and IP owners such as yourself have used. I know this is a trademark crowd, but I wanted to just highlight one of the important areas of our work, which is the PCT, the Patent Cooperation Treaty. We're celebrating this year 40 years of its entry into force. This is really where the vast majority of our resources are allocated and where the majority of our funds come from. It's been hugely successful, so just wanted to highlight that for you. In terms of Madrid, it's been equally successful and continues to grow. Currently we have 116, and I believe even as of last night that's outdated and maybe 117 countries covered by the 100 members, and that represents, as you can see, the vast majority of global trade. You can see on the slide there are some recent accessions, and we're also looking to some of the countries that are signaling that they will be coming on board in the course of 2018, 19, and 20. As you can see, since its humble beginnings in the 90s, the Madrid system continues to grow, and of course that's a function of more countries becoming signatories so that it has a larger global reach. The top 5 classes, probably no surprises there. A lot of goods and services in the IT and business, cloud computing, blockchain, these types of things are very popular these days. Pharmaceuticals, obviously very important year after year for users of the Madrid system. You see there some of the biggest filers from last year, some very important European and global brands. In terms of the countries of filing origins, interesting to see that the US has just a slight edge over Germany. A lot of European countries represented, of course, China becoming more and more important for trademark practitioners and IP owners these days. So a lot of filings coming from that region as well. In terms of the designations, this more or less kind of maps the countries of origin. You see there a lot of designations going to the EU, obviously a lot of attention on China these days, the United States, and a healthy representation of European countries there in terms of Madrid designations in the past year as well. One of the more interesting developments that we wanted to highlight was that over the past couple of years, we've been doing a lot of really excellent work to update and consolidate the Madrid filing and monitoring services. So in your delegate bag, you should have received a brochure, which is sort of a handy quick start guide for the Madrid system e-services. So this has really been kind of peeled back to the kind of most obvious and important pieces in the Madrid filing process. So you can search. We have a search capacity, a global brands database that's growing and growing. We have a filing and monitoring, and then of course the managing side. On our website, within each of these 4 different areas of the Madrid life cycle, you can do a deeper dive and find out more information. There are some really excellent tutorials, videos that walk you through these new Madrid services. So, for those of you who are familiar with Madrid in the past, there were quite a few ways that you would come through to reach the WIPO Secretariat to take care of your Madrid processing. Over the course of the past year or two, we've undertaken a complete streamlining of all of this. So all of these different references to emails for a Madrid team 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, these were effectively internal categorizations. So these were different teams that were working on different batches of applications. But what we've done is we've basically closed all of those. And during the course of the past year, we've created a single point of user contact. So it's a really streamlined interface. There's one place that you come. Then we kind of do the work of filtering that and pointing it to the right direction internally. But we think that's been a huge success and a very welcome initiative to streamline the Madrid services for the users. I mentioned earlier that over the past 5 years, we've seen a number of countries join on to the Madrid protocol. You can see here on the screen some of the countries that are looking to join in the course of the next 2 and 3 years. One of the ones that's really interesting is Canada. Obviously, all of the countries that are listed there are important in their own right, but Canada is one that has been a goal to bring on board, and so that looks likely to happen in the course of the next couple of years. So just a little bit about the Hague system. For those of you who don't know, this is about design. So this is the curve of your iPhone, the curve of a Herman Miller chair, the curve of a bumper, the headlights on a Mercedes, this sort of thing. And similar to Madrid and PCT, WIPO offers a service which is a kind of a centralized portal for managing the Hague application and allocation process. It's a one-stop shop. This is just some of the basics as to how the Hague applications are filed. They can be done in English, French, or Spanish, and they come through the WIPO Secretariat and are similar to the Madrid services, centralized. Internally, they're distributed, and then it's a single user interface for the application process for external users. This is just to show you the contracting parties, and again, with the growth of the Madrid, the Hague is experiencing interesting growth recently and is expecting even further growth in the years to come. You see on the right-hand side some of the countries that have signaled an intention to join onto the Hague system. Canada and Mexico are big ones, and as well China is a very interesting addition to the Hague system. The most popular classes, probably no surprises there, the class 14, class 12, so automobiles, technology, furniture, watches, things like that. Basically, the things that you use and look at every day and may not appreciate that there's a sort of a design art to them, and the Hague system is how these are protected globally. Similar to both the PCT and the Madrid, you see here that the Hague system continues to grow in terms of the number of users from the mid-2000s to where we are today. We're experiencing a lot of growth and bringing on board new staff members to help grapple with that growth over the recent years especially. And one of the things that we're really turning our attention to is streamlining and updating our IT systems so that we can really be much more efficient for the end users. You see there the top 10 Hague applications, strong representation of European members, as with the Madrid system. Some of the more recent developments, the new Hague Express database, obviously this goes back a few years, but as with what we've been doing with Madrid services, a lot of streamlining and efficiency gains, mostly through IT improvements and customer service improvements over recent years. Just a little bit about the Arbitration and Mediation Center, the non-domain name side. So I work in the Arbitration and Mediation Center. On the domain name side, we have colleagues who deal with ADR disputes this could be patent licenses, trademark licenses, coexistence agreements, things like this. This was started in the late 90s. It's had a little bit of a slow growth in early years, but in recent years we've experienced tremendous growth. We've established an office in Singapore for some years now. We have arbitration chambers both in Singapore and in Geneva, and those are really attractive to parties. We provide that on a no-cost basis. We are the only IP specialized ADR provider in the world. Obviously, there are a lot of ADR providers. You have the ICC, the AAA, et cetera, but we really focus on IP, and that allows us to have a tailored list of experts who we can really use to the party's advantage to really be subject matter experts for the mediation or the arbitration case. Our fees, I just want to mention the final point on this slide. Our fees are tremendously competitive across the ADR providers globally. We have the good fortune of being effectively subsidized through our PCT operations, and we are a UN specialized agency. So we're able to provide our ADR services on a less than cost recovery basis. Our fees are really just a token fee. Obviously, the arbitrator or the mediator would charge a flat rate or an hourly fee, but when it comes to our services facilitating the process, we provide that for an extremely cost-attractive proposition. One of the things that we developed over the past couple of years is a clause generator. This is online on our website, so parties can go on our website, and if they have a dispute between parties in different jurisdictions, they want to elect a certain language of proceeding, a certain location for the seat of the arbitration or the mediation, there's a simple to use clause generator. We can work with you to tailor this for your particular dispute, and this has been something that parties have found very valuable in recent years. We also have a fee calculator. As I mentioned earlier, our fees as the service provider for arbitration and mediation services is extremely competitive. You can go on our website and see what the proposed fees would be before you commit to undertaking any ADR services. As you can see on the chart on the bottom, we've experienced strong growth, especially in the past couple years. We've been doing a lot of outreach. We have good relationships with R&D societies, academic societies, universities. One of the things that's been a very positive development is that we have, especially in the past 5 years or so, we've been establishing stronger relationships with a growing number of IP offices around the world. And so this is to either provide services. In some cases, these are tailored. So, for example, if you had parties where one was from the jurisdiction of the filing office, one from an external jurisdiction, they would refer, let's say, an opposition proceeding mediation to the WIPO Secretariat, whereas in some cases, the national IP office, it was two nationals from that jurisdiction. They might want to handle that in-house. But these are really tailored per the preferences of the IP office. But these have been very well received both at the IP office level and at the user level. And we're already starting to see some successes in cases where there have been mediations in, for example, trademark opposition proceedings in recent years. These are just some case examples. Obviously, we need to be very careful about protecting the confidentiality of the parties and the nature of disputes in arbitration and mediation cases. So these are an extremely high-level overview of some recent cases, but we thought it was useful to the extent we can show some of what's going on in the cases. You see, these are some trademark examples. You have coexistence, you have opposition at a national office, and a licensing agreement. And I can tell you that the parties have been very happy with the process, the services that we provide, as well as with the arbitrators and mediators. I helped manage a patent arbitration case about 10 years ago, and we were extremely pleased with the feedback from the parties, even the losing party. This was a highly complex case with patents across a number of jurisdictions involving a number of claims and counterclaims. But even the losing party in this case reached out to us afterwards to share with us that they were very pleased with the way that the case was handled. It was very professional. And so we were very encouraged by that feedback, and that continues to this day. So that's sort of a very quick summary of what's been going on at WIPO in the past year or so in terms of the Madrid, the Hague, and arbitration and mediation services. As I mentioned, I'm very happy to answer questions. My colleague Sarah Amini is here, happy to answer questions on the Madrid side. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. And then we will move on because Brian will continue together with Jonathan, as mentioned, on an update on the UDRP and URS system reform. So please, Brian, do continue.
Just a little change of scenery for you. So this is much more in my wheelhouse, frankly, and I hope, Jonathan, please feel to interrupt and share your views. Jonathan is one of our external experts who helps decide domain name cases, is active, I understand, in the ECTA Internet Committee, and we really look to institutions such as ECTA, MARCS, INTA for support in some of the policy discussions that we're involved in on trademark rights protection, particularly at ICANN. So, let's see. First, just to give you a quick look at the case volume that we're experiencing in the UDRP. As you can see, we've been having a healthy number of cases in recent years. We had a small dip in 2012 and 13. We've come very much back in force, and in 2016, for the first time ever, we passed the 3,000 case mark. We also stayed above the 3,000 case mark last year. Excuse me, we broke the previous record of 2016, and all indications seem to be that we're on track to break that record yet again this year. It's something that really continues to mystify us, frankly. We understand that enforcement budgets are stretched ever thinner. There's a lot more noise out there online, but I think it's really a testament to the fact that the UDRP is very successful. People have come to know it, and they can rely on it for a particular result in cases of infringement of their brands online. So we've had over 40,000 cases now since 1999 when we had the first case. We had one case that year in December. You see some of the types of cases that we're seeing nowadays. So in the past, you had typos of famous marks. You had identical registrations of a famous mark, and the registrant would effectively hold the brand owner out for ransom. And that still happens. But increasingly in the past few years, we're seeing a steady kind of number of cases involving different types of fraud. So we see, unfortunately, a number of phishing type schemes, fake drugs being sold, employment scams, things like that these days, and they seem to be here to stay, unfortunately. But through the UDRP, this is one way that those types of domain names can be reclaimed to minimize brand and consumer harm. And over the years, we've assisted brand owners in reclaiming over 75,000 domain names. That's just at WIPO. It's a pretty staggering figure. It's a testament to both the amount of bad stuff that is happening online, but also the ability of brand owners to chase that up and reclaim infringing names to keep those out of the hands of bad guys. We have now 77 CCTLDs we operate services for. Last year, we started providing services for Sweden and the European Union. Interestingly, if you have an interest in .eu dispute resolution, they've actually started a program when we undertook the casework with them where they're subsidizing the filing fees. They're paying 1,000 euros out of a 1,300 euro filing fee. So, and that's meant to be limited to the first 100 cases. We haven't hit that threshold, but it's obviously something that's very attractive to filing parties if you have infringements going on in the .eu space. This year, just about a month ago, we started providing services for .ge for Georgia. And so this is something that continues small growth in recent years, adding to the stable of CCTLDs we'll provide services for. One of the really useful things that we do is we not only operate the cases, but we do policy work, and part of that policy work is we've captured sort of the state of jurisprudence across UDRP cases in what we call the WIPO overview. Last year in May at the INTA annual meeting, we unveiled our version 3.0, and this was a complete overhaul from the second version. It's doubled in size, doubled in the number of questions that are covered. We really went back to basics and tried to make it as straightforward and plain English as possible. It's been a huge success. Hardly a case is filed nowadays, hardly a decision is rendered where parties aren't citing to the overview. So this really does a lot of the homework for filing parties and panelists. In the past, parties would cite sometimes dozens of cases supporting their proposition, and then the panelists would want to look at that and see, is this really supporting the proposition that they've said? And so we've really distilled all that to the core elements in the overview. And so oftentimes what we see is parties citing straight to the overview nowadays in pleadings and dispensing with the need to have string cites to cases they believe support their proposition. I mentioned earlier that we added a few CCTLDs last year and this year. Alongside that, we're very happy to, this is actually the first time we're mentioning this publicly, but over the course of the past several months, we've been overhauling our CCTLD web pages. They contained a lot of information historically, but it didn't really go into too much details, and there were broken links and things like that just were a kind of a function of the way things evolve on the internet, and we can't possibly stay on top of it all. So what we did is we completely overhauled all of our CCTLD pages. We spoke to a number of users and filing parties to understand what are the types of things that are useful for you to know, to be able to either file a case or undertake a registration in a jurisdiction. So sometimes you would need like a local agent, things like this, or there would be certain registration conditions you would have to meet. So, excuse me, we've gone through all of the CCTLDs for which we provide services, and you see the list of bullet points of the information that we provide now on our website. So this really expands the information that we provide on our web pages for CCTLDs exponentially. This is just to show you an example of a page. So this is the .eu page, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but the arrow, so this is basically the bullet points on the prior slide put into action on the web page. And each of those where the arrow points, those are kind of expand and collapse options. So we have listed the theme, and then if you're interested in a particular area, you can expand on that on the webpage and learn more in detail about the particular ccTLD services. I mentioned our jurisprudential overview already. That was just a screenshot. Just very briefly to hit some of the highlights, one of the areas that was somewhat confusing was the test for confusing similarity. And this is an area that's really settled in recent years. One case that I think is illustrative of this was a number of years back. You have the mark Philip Plein for high fashion. And someone had registered the domain names people in casinos and people in need. And the panelists wrestled with this, saying, this isn't confusingly similar because this is just a string of words that make up a kind of a phrase. But what was actually going on in the case was the page itself was selling counterfeit versions of Philip Plein goods. And in the words people in need, you find buried the Plein mark. And the registrant of this domain name was using some sophisticated algorithms and IT tricks to basically get that site at the top of Google search results. So that case was denied for lack of confusing similarity. That was, like I say, a number of years ago, and things have evolved nowadays to where I think overwhelmingly panelists would find that to meet the confusing similarity test, because you see the word recognizability, the term Plein, even though you have to sort of fish it out, it's recognizable in the domain name. A lot of focus in the overview on the issue of fair use, resellers, criticism, fan sites. The long and short of this is that this is also an area that's evolved and settled significantly in recent years, and where you have either an identical match of the mark or the mark plus a term, so it could be Ford parts or something like this. In the past, there may have been more confusion about whether this is fair use, whether an authorized or unauthorized reseller could use this type of domain name. But what panelists have settled on is these types of terms tend to, at the domain name level, create the impression that this is somehow affiliated with the brand owner. And unless certain criteria are met, these types of domain names usually won't be allowed, and so the brand owner can reclaim those. An important, somewhat unfortunate one, but an important one to be aware of, is domain names which are registered before the brand owner acquires rights. It's the type of case that we see more and more frequently nowadays, especially as the internet gets older. But the way the case law has evolved, this is the type of case that in the past, some brand owners and panelists tried some creative approaches to address this, because you would have cases of blatant infringement where the registrant kind of got away with one because they had registered the domain name before the brand had come into existence. And filing parties and panelists thought, well, this surely can't be right. But some early cases that tested a theory to allow brand owners to reclaim those met with a lot of criticism. And so this is a doctrine that has been really settled in favor of, if a registrant owns a domain name before the brand comes into existence, the EDRP is not a place where you can come to reclaim this, for better or worse.
Maybe one note on the previous slide. Just one note here. Trademark rights doesn't necessarily mean registered rights. It's better that you have registered rights, but there are quite a few decisions that allow unregistered trademark rights to have some kind of an effect. But this is obviously this is not a recommendation. Register your trademark first. But I just wanted to make a note because it says trademark rights.
Yeah, absolutely. The policy doesn't require registered rights. Oftentimes they are. And in our overview, we walk you through some of the criteria that panelists look at to see if your mark is, if you're relying on unregistered rights, if it's acquired, source identifying capability. There's a pretty significant discussion of consolidation principles in our new overview. We looked at hundreds of cases to see what are panelists looking at to consolidate multiple domain names against multiple registrants filed by one brand owner. We really list these out in good detail, so if you have a case where you think registrants are acting in concert, I would strongly recommend looking at these consolidation principles. You see the GDPR on there, and respondent identity. We'll come to that later. Just very briefly about new GTLDs. This is something that's been around now for 4 or 5 years. It's kind of hard to believe, but we're seeing about 15% of our caseload involving new GTLDs. And then, of course, there are a number of .brands that you see there on the screen where brands have applied for their own top-level domain in a more forward-looking way.
Brian was saying that they manage 77 CCTLDs. Anybody has any idea how many CCTLDs exist? So the number is 255 CCTLDs. And how many new GTLDs exist? So, pardon? 1,243, according to ICANN's website yesterday. So just this is for balance. CCTLDs have been there for many, many years, since the internet as we know it began. And this process of the last few years have transformed everything. And we're going to, I think, delve into that transformation in a minute.
Yeah, and obviously it's impossible to look into the crystal ball too deeply, but all indications seem to be that there'll be a new round of new top-level domains in the next couple of years. Obviously, that's something that if there's brands applying for that, that's potentially of interest, but of course it increases monitoring and enforcement burdens if those are open TLDs. So everybody knows that the GDPR came into force just a couple weeks ago now, I guess. It feels like it's been a lot longer than that. We've been looking at this in the lead up to this. A lot of CCTLDs, frankly, were well ahead of the curve on bringing their spaces and our operations and the case work into compliance with the GDPR prior to ICANN and the UDRP. But be that as it may, we've been participating in ICANN discussions on this to make sure that as a UDRP provider, we can have access to information so that the cases can proceed. Brand owner access is another question altogether. This is something that there's an ICANN meeting in Panama in a week and a half's time, and this is obviously the biggest topic of discussion. And it looks like over the course of the next year or so, ICANN and its different stakeholders will be working out a model where brand owners can apply for access to information that you used to be able to get freely and publicly at an instance notice. So it's not clear what that process will look like. The early indications are that there will be some sort of an accreditation clearinghouse where a brand owner would sort of prove up its rights and get a token which it would take to a registrar, which would then look to assess whether they have a legitimate interest in obtaining the registrant information that's behind the cloaked who is. So far, we haven't had any difficulties with, as a provider, getting information from registrars. We are aware that there are 1 or 2 registrars that are charging a fee to brand owners. Some are throwing up difficulties. On the whole, it seems to be coming together in a way that kind of works, but of course, from the research and enforcement side, this is something that is becoming much more difficult.
I have to make you run faster because we're running out of time.
So I think we're coming kind of to the conclusion of my slides, and we're coming to Jonathan's slides, where we wanted to discuss a little bit of, on the one hand, the GDPR and what it's going to look like in the future. ICANN is reviewing the UDRP and the URS and a few other rights protection mechanisms that it created for its new GTLD program. I'll just mention here that it's a very protracted process. There are some very deeply held views that are at complete loggerheads with each other. I recently started co-chairing this working group after another IP representative stepped down. We've been at it for almost 2.5 years. We haven't made a ton of progress, but we're starting to hit a little bit of a momentum stride. There are a lot of questions about what the future of the UDRP will look like. I'll leave with this and then transition to Jonathan. One of the more interesting things that we've observed over the past year or so is if we were to look back 5 or 4 or 3 or 2 years ago, both brand owners and registrants and other stakeholders were very, very interested in making a lot of changes to the UDRP. whether that was to strengthen it, to weaken it, to make some process improvements. But there were a lot of ideas floating around, and I think now that we're in this working phase, people are realizing that it's going to be very difficult to get consensus around some of these more radical proposed changes. One, for example, that was floated by the domain community was a statute of limitations to file a case. Obviously, that would have a radical impact on brand owners.
It does exist in China, if you don't know. So there's a 2-year statute of limitation in China. So if you're not aware and somebody took your domain name in China, after 2 years you can't actually do anything aside from going to court. But you can't use the local policy.
But one of the things that, just to conclude, is that now over the past year or so, we've seen that a lot of people, brand owners, domain representatives, seem to prefer to keep the status quo. I think the thought is the UDRP may not be perfect, and there may be things that we would all like to see change, but what are the trade-offs that we'll need to make, and are the risks worth the potential benefits?
So we'll change to... So there's another presentation, but what we're going to take you through now is something maybe a little different. So I'm going to try and delve into some of what's going on with the URS and the UDRP, and I'll have Brian assist me. I think the important thing to understand is that this is like, it's a whole cosmos. It's like a whole world that things happen. Oh, sorry, I can use this. I was trying to use my laptop. So a lot of things, Brian discussed this. My number of 50,000 cases is different because there are a lot of cases outside WIPO. But I'm going to talk just a minute about something called a PDP. A PDP is a policy development process. According to some view, it is a basic best practice to review all long-standing policies after implementation. So I can basically control what we do with domain names right now. And this is what your clients, or if you're a trademark owner, this is what you actually use on the internet. And I can control all this, and this is controlled through processes called PDPs. There are something called consensus policies, which are part of agreements between ICANN and a lot of other people who give you domain names. So this is why it's important. So it's a process that comes about to review what's going on with the UDRP and the URS and a lot of other unrelated policies. It started in 2011. But it only began for the URS in 2017, and the reason was that the URS was launched in 2012, actually started in operation 2013. And we'll see a little about that. The question was obviously, should it even be reviewed? And maybe Brian can say a word about, should it be reviewed?
Yeah, I think I know on some subsequent slides you'll see that there's only been frankly a handful of cases. So our view has been that it's still too early to review it. We've sort of taken a quick snapshot and see that it seems to be working as intended. Some people aren't happy with the result. You don't actually reclaim the domain name, but on the whole, it seems to be working.
The interesting thing is, how many cases are there for URS? Look, I didn't even put 2013. There were a handful of cases at the time. I think around 80. I can't remember. But if you actually take a look, the URS is not doing that well. Actually, there's a drop in the number of URS cases. And if you compare it to UDRP, it's only 1.5% of the total. So the big question is, why actually review this thing? And maybe the answer goes to how these PDPs work. And there's a way that these groups works that everybody can say whatever they want, right? And the URS was part of the fact that the process started. So things probably went in that way that people thought it's better to start with the URS. And they did start with the URS. Although, as far as I'm concerned, it looks like it's a bit of a waste of time. But taking this forward, let's see what the URS actually does. So do the results suggest that there's a necessity for this? And actually, when you look at the results, there are only 827 cases. 723 were suspended. So if you don't know, the only remedy you can get is suspension. That means about 73% of the cases were suspended. Although, Brian, you may have some different statistics on that?
I was actually going to say, I was going to try to do some quick math, but I'll do it off the top of my head. You see 827 cases, that's in 4 years. But one of the things to bear in mind, and this is one of the policy questions, is that the URS, which is a sort of a lighter version of the UDRP, but you don't get the domain name reclaimed, you only have it suspended for a year, it doesn't apply to .com. So that's one of the big policy questions, and it's very uncertain whether it will continue to only apply to new GTLDs or whether it will apply to .com in the future. But even that said, when we're looking at apples to apples in terms of new GTLD cases that we've administered under the UDRP, it's far more popular than the URS, and that primarily comes down to the fact that the brand owner can reclaim the domain name and keep it out of the hands of infringers.
Right, and the URS was supposed to be something quick and dirty. So if you have a really, a cyber squatter, and it's very evident that he took your domain name and is doing something that's very evidently is evidence of cyber squatting, then you should use the URS. But the results are similar to the UDRP as far as percentage is concerned. And at the end of the day, it's not very effective. But it is an indication what's going to happen with the UDRP, and this is why it's really important to take note of what's going on within these processes. There was a report called Preliminary Issues to be reviewed, and a number of items came up that these policy development groups are going to look into. The first one was whether a response up to a year after can be made after a year after the default or the termination. So if you don't know, in the UDRP, once you have a decision, that's it, it's final. You can't really go anywhere. Oh, I have 2 minutes. So you can't really go anywhere, but let me cut through a lot. So I'm gonna just read a little. I think the important thing to discuss here is that the important issue is whether the standard of proof is going to change. So is it going to be clear and convincing, or are there going to be other standards of proof? What about other remedies? So the remedy that we now have is suspension. It's suspension for the life of the domain name registration. But what about transfer or cancellation? So these are the important items. I'm going to skip this. These are possible outcomes. So I'm going to skip this. It's less important. Where do these PDP go? So right now there are 3 sub-teams, one URS examiner, providers, and documents. Basically, the group says we need more information. They set up these subgroups. I was on a call yesterday with one. Brian was chairing another. This is just in one day. So a lot is going on, and there's a lot of people who are actually trying to minimize the effect of UDRP and URS. I noted here the URS study by Professor Tushnet. I actually misspelled her name, probably because she gave us all a hard time. She put something called a qualitative review, but maybe, do you think it's a qualitative review?
It sort of straddles pure facts and qualitative review, and that's part of the difficulty in this, frankly, is, and this is what my, I guess, kind of conclusion or final plea would be, is that, you know, we understand that this, whether it's the URS or the UDRP, domain names, this is one piece of a big enforcement puzzle. But these policy development groups, they have a lot of people who have a very strong interest in the outcome of these mechanisms like the UDRP. Some of them are at odds with brand owners' wishes. And frankly, they put a lot more time and energy in this, and we really feel outmatched. And so we really, we look to organizations like ECTA, we look to individuals like yourselves. We know it's like I said, one piece of the puzzle. It's a tremendous amount of work with uncertain results. But we came to the conclusion over recent months that, you know, we can try to impact it from the outside or from the inside. And so we've tried to take a more active role, and we really hope to be able to count on more people.
I think an example of the fact that we had an initial list of topics that were a bit, I would suspect were very common to the fact that the URS was working the way it was working. And what Brian was speaking about is how this is developed. And you can see what's from some of these remedies is that people who don't really like the URS would like the effect of the URS and the UDRP to be more, I would say, domainer pro. They propose different types of changes. These, for example, would include changes in language, sanction against trademark owners for misuse of the URS. So if you're a trademark owner and you're trying to use the URS, you may be sanctioned if their way is going to prevail at the end of the day. And they're also turning their heads towards providers. Are their procedures fair? And they even want alternative to the URS, whatever that means. Some actually recently, just a few days ago, suggested a checklist for panelists to go through, procedural and substantive. So basically telling you as a panelist, did you actually make sure that if you find the finding of bad faith, that you actually wrote down all the relevant facts and you addressed everything that was filed. I'm going to go, I don't have time, but I did want to go into something completely different with this, which is a note about the WHOIS and the GDPR. Brian touched on the GDPR and the fact that now the major tool for trademark owners to actually find those who are cyber squatters is literally gone. So this is thank you to the European Union. We have the GDPR, and what the GDPR did was basically change the way that WHOIS results look like. And this is how they look like now. So you basically can only see the country, and you can only see an anonymized email, which I understand in most cases doesn't really work anymore. In some cases, I understand that legal entities are shown, but the ones I tried, like this is France.com, which is involved with a very interesting case, if you want to read up on it. It doesn't tell you who the registrant is. So how do I file a UDRP or a URS? Does that mean that the URS or UDRP are in danger? Obviously, there are some reasons to say that we may have reasons to be concerned. And I wanted to touch in a few words on ECTA's position. So ECTA's position thinks right now that ICANN position is too limiting. So what ICANN did was ICANN said, we're going to give some preliminary responses. In our preliminary responses, all of our, I would say, contractees, those who are registrars, so we have a contract with, will have to show a certain amount of data on their WHOIS. And we believe that what ICANN was putting out was limiting. We think that the legal person should be shown. ECTA thinks that the state, province, and country should also be shown, and that the email should be shown and not anonymized one, because anonymized emails don't really work. We also recommended as part of a position paper from ECTA to amend the UDRP to ease the requirements, basically to shift the burden on the second element, for those of you who know and recognize the elements of the UDRP. And also, Brian touched on the accreditation program, and that accreditation program is a program that will allow trademark owners access to WHOIS information. We think that if there's a legitimate purpose, trademark owners should receive the information. Legitimate purpose could be the fact that you own a trademark, and that the URS and the URP should be maintained. So this is my last slide. So is the UDRP URS dead because of these changes, and especially with the GDPR? It's still working as far as I can tell. There are something called John Doe cases. So in the past, when you didn't know who the registrant was, you would file the case and you would say, well, tell me who that person is, because he's behind something called a privacy shield. So it's not really different. The registrars will have to provide the information to providers. So from my perspective, this basically puts a shift in the burden. The burden shifts from, I would say, complainants to providers, and from providers to registrars. So poor these guys. I mean, I really feel sorry for Brian's case managers, because they're going to have to do a lot more work. But can we as trademark owners help? And probably yes. There's a question of cost, so you can conduct investigations. You can request information from providers. I do know that some providers do provide information, but not all of them. And I even heard the suggestion that the URS, somebody can file a URS case. Because when you file a URS case, it's $300, $300 to $500. And what happens is you file it with the providers, and the provider has to basically find who that registrant is. So you basically get the information. But since you can't amend the URS complaint, you're going to have to refile it again. Is it a good way to go about it? I don't think so. My time is up. I just one note. I wanted to thank Delia Belchio, who's the chair of the Internet Committee, because she did all the amazing work on the ECTA position with respect to GDPR and WHOIS. So thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers. Moving on to the next session. Thank you.